I'm going to show you how I make my texture stamps to apply to the sculpture. This is monster clay. I like monster clay for this purpose because you can melt it in a pot and then you can pour it to a certain level into a cookie sheet, which gives you a flat area to sculpt. So once you've poured that and it's set up, you can sculpt the particular texture that you want to use into the clay, and it's usable for different kinds of texture. I am doing dinosaur texture on this, or what we believe to be our dinosaur texture for some wrappers. Okay, once you have the sculpture or the texture that sculpted into the pan, it's probably a good idea to spray a mold release onto it. Typically, you can use a lot of different kinds of mold material. I tried to use the cheapest stuff I could find. This is RealFlex from Smooth On. It's a pourable and it's just a polyurethane. You pour it into the pan, let it set up, and then after it's set up, then you pull it out, and you have a negative mold of the texture that you want to produce. Once you have your mold, turn it up and mix up some. I just use regular molding plaster because my preferred material to make my texture stamps is latex. Latex sets up very quickly into an untreated mold of molding plaster. So that's what I use. Mix up my plaster just by hand or with a brush, making sure you just need to want to make sure that you're using a brush or something to make sure all the bubbles are out of your texture, so you don't, when you lay your texture in, you don't have a bunch of air bubbles showing up in your texture. So you just lay this out. It sets up in a few hours, and then you can just pull this off, and you have the mold of your texture stamp that you're going to create with your latex. Okay, once your plaster mold is dry, set up, drier the better, but it doesn't have to be completely dry. You can do this within an hour or two of putting the plaster on your positive or negative mold. But you want to use, I like to use the latex because it sets up quickly, it's flexible, and just the easiest for me to make my texture stamps. Now, using a brush, you just want to stipple it onto your mold. So make sure that you're not creating any bubbles, and you want to lay it out over your entire mold for the first layer. Then you can either come back the next day, or you can force it dry in a few minutes with a heat gun, so you can do another layer. Now, it's very important as you make this texture stamp that you fade in each successive layer, because you don't want to create a hard edge. It's a problem, or it can be a problem when you're laying the final texture with the epoxy putty. So for each layer, you want to come in an additional quarter of an inch or so, so that it goes from one layer to 3 or 4 layers for the final texture. Once your latex is fully cured, and for this one I use 4 layers. It's something that you will need to just determine for yourself what works best for the texture stamp that you're using. This one will work good for just 4 layers. Now, what to make sure that you do is powder you can use talcum powder. This is a thickening agent that I use for the epoxy, and we'll also use it as we make the stamps. You want to make sure that you powder the back of the stamp very well, because otherwise, as most of you probably know, latex wants to stick to itself. So And once you have the powder in place, then you pull it off the mold. Powder the backside. And you have a texture stamp to use. Now, depending on what the kind of sculpture that you have, I will always do 3 or 4 at least different kinds of sculpture of texture, even if it's basically the same kind of texture, so I don't get a pattern in whatever I'm laying the texture on. So this will be just one. This will work really well if I want to add wrinkles or any kind of texture going around a round surface or that sort of thing in the final product.